It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, November 1st, 2024 in Los Angeles. He is Sam Park. In Reno, Nevada, I am John Ramey. We have elections in Japan and Georgia, the European Georgia. We have a U.S. jobs report impacted by hurricanes and possibly strikes. And we have a brief correction regarding our story on BRICS from last week. Don't trust any outlet that doesn't issue corrections, Sam Park. People make mistakes. Journalists make errors. And so that's my community note for this edition.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, let's start in Japan. They had an election this past weekend.
Yes.
Japan is a country of 124 million people. It has the fourth largest GDP in the world. The BBC reports the coalition led by Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, has lost its majority in parliament, its worst result in over a decade. The LDP and its much smaller coalition partner have taken 215 seats together, falling short of the 233-seat majority needed to govern. The party's new leader, Shigeru Ishiba, said there are no plans to expand the coalition at this stage. This is now AP reporting. It's largely a reflection of voters' anger at the repeated financial scandals that have hit the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, which has ruled Japan nearly without interruption since 1955. And when I read that, Sam, the first thing I think of is no matter how great the party, if it's one-party rule, there are going to be problems at some point.
Yes, and it's sort of astonishing, actually, that one party can rule a democratic country for that long. And Japan is sort of an outlier in that regard. That really just doesn't happen in all that many other places. And
Not without rampant corruption.
That's right. And so, I mean, Japan is definitely a democratic system, but it is kind of odd. We might consider them a sort of, I wouldn't go so far as to say a flawed democracy, but it just seems strange. As all
How could they be flawed, Sam? They modeled their system after we conquered them in the Second World War.
Well, they actually didn't do that modeling, but as a matter of fact. But at any rate, and I think an additional problem here is that this doesn't actually create an opening for an opposition party to take over, right? Even though the ruling coalition led by the LDP, which is actually the center-right party of Japan, they're still going to end up forming the government, and one way or another. Mainly because it's sort of like the main opposition party, which is now called the Constitutional Democratic Party, formerly known as the Democratic Party of Japan. They just never get any reps. Right, so they just they are so used to never being in government that it's difficult for them to even know how to run, and the things went very badly for them the last time they were in government. Not only, but largely because of the tsunami that ended up in the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster. They happened to be in government at that time. Now they were having problems.
That's terrible luck.
Yes, it is, right? But they were
That's
having
13
problems
years ago, too.
They were having problems already just because of lack of reps. They had no idea how to govern because they'd never gotten to do it. And so this is, like I was sort of intimating before, it's not a particularly healthy democratic system, right? In that there's no alternation of power between the two parties. And so you have one party that's just sort of incapable of doing anything, even on the rare occasions when they manage to get into power. And then the forever incumbent party that's just riven with not just corruption, but infighting, right? Because if you're the only party in town that ever gets to govern, you instantly all start fighting amongst each other, right? To be the person in control. And so now, again, everybody knows what's going to happen. The LDP and the Komeito, which is the sort of social conservative party, they're going to figure, perhaps they'll have a minority government or wrangle some smaller party in with them. But they'll end up forming the government regardless. And so at least it's a stable system, right? Nobody's worried about what's going to happen in Japan. And of course, Japan is one of the oldest, that is demographically, one of the oldest societies on Earth. So, I mean, they're not a thriving, dynamic economy. They're just sort of poking along. Everything's fine, right? But they're not sort of this, even though they're one of the world's largest economies, they're just sort of, a stable, kind of low growth country that full of old people. And nobody's worried about them. It's just kind of not very exciting. And I think if you're a young person in Japan, you kind of wonder what things are going to be like for you.
Okay, so there are a couple of notes I want to bring up. First of all, I just want to observe that with the one-party rule, Japan is oddly similar, although not in a nepotistic sense, with other East Asian democracies.
Yes.
We tend to, or I tend to think that Japan is not like Thailand in that sense or whatever, but one-party rule is one-party rule.
Yes.
The other note, and this has been commented on in the media, this is a Reuters report. I'm quoting Tomohiko Taniguchi, a former advisor to late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Quote, from Beijing's viewpoint, so how China views this election result signals an ideal scenario, a politically immobilized Japan. Now, that plus the potentially destabilizing U.S. election this coming Tuesday, and then you think about what's been going on in Germany, right? These traditional U.S. allies, I don't want to feed a narrative, but there's a way this breaks that we see not just cracks in the post-Second World War order, but like outright crumbling of it.
Yeah, and it's
Am I being alarmist?
No, I don't think so. And it's all seemingly due to sort of fatigue.
Yeah,
right?
Everybody's just kind of bored with the status quo.
Well, maybe not bored, but they're just not kind of they're just tired of it. Right. They just don't feel like it's all working out. And you could understand, right? I mean,
I actually can't understand that, Sam. I would like somebody to read.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. I mean,
first half of the 20th century was a drag.
All right. But you can understand, first of all, nobody remembers that.
That's my point, and it's terrible.
All right. But
they did write it down.
Okay, all the way through this year in Electorama 2024, we've been covering all these elections, right? And in Japan, it's just part of the pattern in which the incumbent party takes it on the chin, right? Yeah. Make sure they're still going to end up in power, right? But with a much reduced, with no majority, and find it very difficult to govern. Sort of like in India, right? Where the BJP, the BJP incumbent party lost their majority, right? And so all these systems just sort of don't seem to be fit for purpose at the moment, right? And we're going to see what happens here next Tuesday. And I would say, regardless of what happens here, it's not like everyone's going to think, oh, everything's okay, right? Whichever side wins, it's still going to be a lot of problems in this country. And I think that's true no matter what. And look at what happened with the French elections, right? It took them a month or something to form a government. Although I would say, at least in France, they were able to run the entire election in 3 weeks. And I think that's fantastic, right? I mean, the results weren't everything.
You're talking about the campaign as well.
Yeah, the entire thing. And I think one of the problems that we have specifically in our country is how long the election season is.
It doesn't really stop at this point.
That's right. And there's no good reason for that. Right?
Oh, there is a good reason, media profiteering.
Okay, fine. But that's a bad reason. Okay. It doesn't help anybody except people in the media trying to make money. It's bad for democracy itself, I would argue. And so
just a note, I'm criticizing media management. They're not reporters, not journalists.
I would agree with that. Although
media owners.
But the fact is, the media owners help set up certain incentive systems that the reporters have to respond to. And I think that helps explain some of the proliferation of, independent media, podcasts, and things like this, where in which reporters like, you know what, I'm sick of working for these people who are not actually looking out for people's best interest here. I can make as much of a living or maybe a little less, but at least feel like I'm, my own boss instead of having to constantly answer to the interests of shareholders and media companies.
We could, but we won't delve into more extensive media criticism regarding coverage of the U.S. election.
No, we have plenty of other things to talk about.
Yeah,
honestly.
but just to come back to Japan, I'm glad you mentioned France, because in this Reuters report regarding China, rubbing its hands with glee regarding Japanese political immobilization, that was the third pillar they mentioned of U.S. allied countries rejecting established parties following recent elections in France, Germany, and now Japan.
Just to kind of but at least
tie a bow on that thought.
At least in France, there are mechanisms in place that were able to stave off an outright victory by the far right. And so that's, I think, a big help. And, it's not like everything's great in Europe. It certainly isn't,
sure.
Right? But they have certain kind of guardrails and filters that are set up and seem to be holding up moderately well, if not very well.
One other note about Japan, this loss to the LDP was not because there's some super ascendant hard far right.
No.
Which is A, good, and B, maybe bucks the trend in France and Germany.
I guess, but we might flip that over and say it's more dispiriting because it's simply internal decay. Right? I mean, it's just the system just kind of slowly grinding to a halt.
Darn it, Sam.
Mr. Sunshine.
Oh, man. Can we move to Georgia?
Please. Now, it's on my mind.
This is not the Georgia of Otis Redding, Ray Charles, Little Richard, and James Brown map here. This is Georgia that sits almost completely astride the broad isthmus between the Black and Caspian Seas.
Yes, the Caucasus, as it's known.
Caucasus, thank you.
You're welcome. As a Caucasian, John, I thought you would be able to get that.
Yeah, well, it's not centered in my personal identity.
Really?
Yeah. Not the physical
When did this happen?
The Caucasus. I don't think often about the specific geographic region. Hey, now.
Come on, I was right over the plate. What am I supposed to do? Not swing? Give me a break.
Listen, our common friend Terrence Newman made sure that I was bringing enough sunblock when we were doing a Zoom interview.
Oh, good for him. I'm glad.
Game at Hawaii. So, yeah.
Good job,
Everybody should get their cuts in. Okay, so Dateline Tbilisi, Reuters. For some Georgians who supported the ruling Georgian Dream Party in Saturday's disputed parliamentary election, the aspiration to go west towards the European Union had to be balanced by the brutal reality of the need to keep peace with Russia. Opposition and foreign observers have cast the election as a watershed moment that would decide if Georgia moves closer to Europe or leans back towards Russia amid the war in Ukraine. Georgian Dream clinched 54% of the vote on Saturday. That's what the Electoral Commission said. Opposition parties and the president claimed the election had been stolen, and the West called for investigations into reports of voting irregularities. It's not the only Georgia that we're worried about regarding election irregularities.
No. And
observer groups, including the 57-nation Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, said alleged violations, including ballot stuffing, bribery, voter intimidation, and violence, could have affected the election's outcome. Yikes.
Yes, this is a very serious situation, especially for the people in Georgia, but it has implications across the continent, I would say.
I left one thing out. Georgia, 4 million people, 107th largest GDP. Sorry, carry on.
Yes, it's not a very large country, and it's a former Soviet republic. It was also the locus of what we would think of today as the first sort of testing of the waters by Vladimir Putin back in 2008, when there was a sort of border dispute between Russia and Georgia. And the two northern regions of Georgia attempted to secede and were stopped from doing so. And they were supported by the Russians.
who are just across the Georgian northern border.
That's right. Now, this election result, if it stands, and it seems as though it will, there was a partial recount that seemed to confirm Georgian Dream had won the election. And so this will, according to European Union officials, put Georgia's European Union candidacy on ice.
Right.
And so, even though opinion polls show that 80% of Georgians would like to join the European Union, and you can understand why.
Sorry, I misspoke earlier. Georgian Dream is the not European leaning.
That's right.
Party.
They're the pro-Russia party. That is, they are now. They weren't all that way when they started out about a decade ago, but they almost instantly, upon gaining power, started moving towards the pro-Russia camp, and under the leadership of their founder, Bidzina Ivanishvili.
Very well executed, Sam. I have that written here, but I wasn't going to attempt it. He's a
I'm
billionaire.
not sure I'm actually pronouncing. I don't know how the accents are supposed to go. It might be not Ivanishvili, but right. I'm not exactly certain about that. But he is
Ivanishvili is a billionaire.
Yes, he is Georgia's richest man, with a fortune estimated at about $4.5 billion or so, which, as billionaires go today, isn't all that much. But in Georgia, it's quite a lot.
Bet it goes a long way.
And he made his money back in the early post-Soviet Union days, then in Russia, right, as part of the privatization of Russian government state assets. In his case, mostly minerals and some other, I think, telecommunications as well. And then he returned to Georgia to found the Georgian Dream Party. And he was prime minister for a year upon Georgia Dream taking control of the government. And then he retired from politics.
Clearly.
And seems to have decided, I think correctly, that it was just easier to not actually have to be in office, right? He could run the party just as Georgia's richest man.
One other, I thought, harrowing line from this report from Reuters. The ruling party, Ivanishvili, says it wants to one day join the EU, but it must also avoid confrontation with President Vladimir Putin's Russia. That could leave the South Caucasus republic devastated like Ukraine. I mean, that is a real and in the neighborhood circumstance that voters had to think about.
And, it's no joke, right?
And as much as we want to talk about liberal democracy, like, missiles landing on cities might be a more convincing argument.
He has said we're not going to change Russia. We might rather change ourselves, right? Which, is, I think, a terrible thing to say, but that's easy for me to criticize when I'm sitting here in Los Angeles and I'm not sharing a border with Russia. And by the way,
expansionist Russia.
That's right. And by the way, Georgia, unlike almost every country in the European Union, does not share a land border with the European Union, as does, for instance, Ukraine, right? They're across the Black Sea from numerous EU members, that is a couple, which are Romania and Bulgaria, but they don't share a land border, while they do share one with Russia. That's kind of, something that they might want to think about. Now, there's no rule in the European Union that you have to share a land border with the Union in order to be part of it. But as a matter of fact, the only countries that don't are islands. So Malta doesn't share a land border with anybody. So and Ireland,
right,
used to share a land border with a fellow EU member, but they don't anymore because that member decided to quit.
Shall we talk about the U.S. economy?
Sure.
Okay. Got a jobs report, hot off the presses. People even know what that means. Job creation in October slowed to its weakest pace since late 2020. This is the weakest job report in the Biden administration.
By far, yeah.
The last time so few jobs were created, Donald Trump was president. as the impacts of storms in the Southeast and a significant labor impasse dented the employment picture. This is CNBC. Non-farm payrolls increased by 12,000 for the month. So we've been talking about 100,000 jobs as being kind of or 100 and change thousand jobs as being kind of tepid previously. This is just 12,000 jobs, down sharply from September and down from the estimate from Dow Jones of 100,000, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics on this very Friday. October posted the smallest gain since December 2020. However, the unemployment rate held at 4.1%, in line with expectations. The Bureau of Labor Statistics noted that the Boeing strike likely subtracted 44,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector, which lost 46,000 positions overall. So that would be a needle-moving event.
Absolutely, yeah.
Elsewhere, the Bureau said the average hourly earnings increased 0.4% for the month, which is slightly higher than the estimate. And the 12-month gain in wages is 4%. And 4% wage gain over the last 12 months. Let's dovetail into the CBS report about the inflation rate, dropped to 2.1%. Okay.
Yes.
2.1% according to the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. I mean, this is in the weeds.
Almost right
but
there.
My point is, wages have grown at 4% over the last 12 months. Inflation has been at 2% over the last 12 months. These are positive indicators. And even due to 2 devastating hurricanes and a huge strike in the manufacturing section, the economy is still adding jobs.
Yes, although at a much slower pace. For example, that even without the Boeing strike, right, that it would still be a pretty weak jobs report. And so it does seem that
not a recession.
No, certainly not. It does seem that hiring is slowing. That inflation target figure is amazing, right? The personal consumption index that you talked about is said to be the Federal Reserve's favorite
the old PCE.
Inflation index to look at. And it's just 0.1 of a percentage point above their 2% inflation target. And so people at the Federal Reserve, I'm sure they're very, very happy. And
do you think they have like a touchdown celebration dance they do in the office when the numbers come in?
I mean, but apart from the softening labor market, things in the economy are actually going rather well. The GDP growth annualized, that figures were just released, 2.8% growth. And
Germany's been contracting for 2 years.
That's right. And the Eurozone in general, right, annualized growth is 0.4%. So the American economy over the past year has been growing 7 times the rate of the European economy.
Nobody wants to hear it, Sam.
Well, it's not so much a question of them wanting to hear it as getting used to hearing it or getting used to the conditions. For example, we talked about, and I'm sorry, I have to mess with my earphone a little bit here, which just popped out of my ear. But inflation for, many, many episodes already. And I think people are getting used to the idea that prices are never going to go back to what they were before the pandemic.
Not unless there was an economic catastrophe.
That's right. And so these are just going to be the prices from now on, and they're not going up as quickly anymore. So I think people are starting to understand that. And as I think we've talked about in earlier episodes, back in the late 70s and early 80s, inflation was so much worse and went on for so much longer that when
rates were much higher.
That's right. And so that when inflation stopped rising, that by itself was enough of a relief for people. Whereas today, it's not, right? Because it hasn't been as big a problem, the remedies don't seem as effective, if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
Right? Getting over a bad case of the flu is not as good as beating cancer, right? Even though your overall health is actually better.
Right. On an inflationary note, I believe it was Catherine Rampell from the Washington Post pointed out that over the last 50 years, United States domestic energy production has outgrown our energy consumption, right?
So there's a net order.
Yeah. So just another incorrect narrative, along with the economy's terrible, that is driving the political reality in the United States, is this notion that we're not generating enough fossil fuel or energy more generally, right? We are by far the world's biggest oil producer now. I think we produce more than Russia and Saudi Arabia, like 3 million more than I think Russia barrels daily. This notion
we're adding clean energy all the time.
All the time. So this notion that gas prices are high because the lefties don't let oil companies drill is just preposterous. And we're seeing so many data points now that show the United States economy remains the envy of the world in the post-pandemic economic landscape. And the Biden administration and Vice President Harris cannot gain political traction with that.
Okay, you're right about that. But part of the reason for that is that politicians don't actually have all that much impact on the economy. They do here and there, all right? Things like the Inflation Reduction Act, that does make a difference, actually, and it has helped.
Not imposing indiscriminate tariffs.
Yes.
Helps.
But the problem is that politicians know that economic conditions are going to determine their fate, right? And so they have to maintain this fiction that they're the ones pulling the levers. Right.
Like they've got a dial in the Oval Office about where the gas prices should be and
what
inflation should be.
Exactly. And that's just not the case, but they have to act as though it is. And they also, and let's face it, economics is not an easy discipline to understand, right? You have to sort of be rather literate in its terminologies and methodologies to really get an idea of how it works. Even you and I, John, who do this every week, we end up scratching their heads about things on a regular basis because, again, we're just laymen, right? We're not professionals, but we do try to provide a decent layman's understanding of how this works. But for instance, if I were the Democratic candidate, I would say something like, listen, I understand that inflation is bad, and that's why I'm pursuing an affordability agenda. But inflation was caused not by my party or the other party. It was
worse
caused
everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, it was caused by the pandemic, which was a global event, and therefore the resulting inflation was also a global event. It was not as bad in our country as it was in any other country. That's right. And so the idea that this is our failing, it's just wrong. And my opponents know that it's wrong, and they're lying to you when they're blaming us for it. And now the problem is that's several sentences, each of which contains, numerous clauses in a row. Right.
And if you're explaining, you're losing, Sam.
Right. But I'm sorry. But to me, it's a question of tone. Right. Yeah. And saying, look, this is really what's happening. And the other people who tell you something else is happening are lying to you. But we've been in this world for such a long time where politicians feel that they have to take credit for things or blame the other party for things. And that we can't get out of it. I think having a two-party system also doesn't help. Right? Because it's either one party or the other party. And so everything has to be the fault of that other party instead of, oh, well, I don't want to, alienate a possible future coalition partner, which would be the case if we had more than two parties. I think that doesn't help.
Right. Because anytime you might compromise or work together, if you're the party not in power, you're essentially helping your opposition stay in power.
That's right.
So there is very little incentive in the modern political environment, in our current political environment, for that kind of cooperation, which we now kind of look at nostalgic style and say, gosh, people were just more civic minded,
I guess,
40 years ago or 70 years ago.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've been dealing with this blame each other for the economy environment for decades. Like you say, 70 years ago, that's right. Okay, that's, 50s American prosperity.
Eisenhower endured, I think, 2 recessions.
Yes, but but it was still a time of rising standards of living very broadly, right? This didn't become a problem until the 70s and 80s, which was really the first very bad economic episode that this country had seen since the Great Depression. And that's
and it
really
started the erosion of the manufacturing base.
yes. And it also, I think, was when the parties began to be very polarized. And I mean, that might just be a coincidence. But as our listeners
somehow I doubt it.
Yeah, okay, fine. But as our listeners can probably tell, all of these stories, right, are related in one way or another to the election coming up next Tuesday. And
this is our last episode.
Prior there too. That's right.
Yeah.
And so by the time we record next week's episode, we might know who the winner is, but we might not. And so we'll address these issues in as much as we have enough information, but I'm not expecting that we necessarily will. I would add, by the way, that even if we know who the winner is, we're not going to get a comprehensive data set about the electorate until about the end of the year. And so any analysis that we or anybody else is going to offer you about why the election went the way it did is incomplete and really the worst kind of speculation. We'll find out, all right? But don't listen to anybody who tries to tell you that it was because of A, B, and or C, right? Because there will be at least X, Y, there up to X, Y, Z of factors that went into this, and we're not going to know what those are for months.
Well, I mean, I think if an analyst stipulates up front that it's incomplete and then speculates,
yeah,
okay,
but they never do that though, John. I mean, very seldom do I hear political commentators issue those sorts of disclaimers.
Amy Cook and Tamara Keith will.
Okay, fine. All right, yeah. Amy Walter,
excuse me, Cook Political Report.
Yeah. Of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter featuring Pitbull.
All right. Corrections and retractions. We discussed BRICS.
Yes.
And the BRICS summit last week. And,
and we wondered why Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wasn't in attendance.
Yeah.
And this was not widely reported. I actually don't.
No, it was not.
Right. Is that the Saudis didn't actually join BRICS.
Even though it was announced that they would be joining on the first of the year, January 1st, 2024.
That's right.
They were. So Argentina joined and quit, and Saudi Arabia said they were joining and then never joined?
I think that it became clear first that Argentina wasn't going to join. As I recall, the Argentine election happened very shortly after it was announced that they were going to join. And then as soon as Milei won, it became clear that they were not going to.
So BRICS Plus is just Egypt, Ethiopia,
Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Yes. And I think, honestly, the reason for Saudi Arabia not joining is obviously October 7th, right? They couldn't really be, seen to be joining the same club as Iran at that moment. They can't stand Hamas, right? They can't stand Hezbollah. They can't stand Iran, actually, even though they've been trying to normalize relations with them just to keep the peace. But October 7th just threw all that out the window. And so, again, Mohammed bin Salman's just generally been keeping a low profile for the past year and doesn't seem to know exactly what to do. But in this case, he knew what not to do.
Okay. So the U.S. presidential election takes place on Tuesday, or concludes on Tuesday.
Yes, Amnon Navaz of the PBS NewsHour refers to it as the last day of voting.
The last day of voting, right.
I
have already voted.
Day.
Have you already voted?
Yeah.
Okay. Any thoughts? Any final thoughts?
No, again, we might not know the victor by the time next week's episode rolls around, and we'll analyze what has happened in as much as we can. I'm almost hopeful that we're not going to know, not just for partisan reasons, but because there's so many things that we could be talking about right now that we don't have time for.
Right.
And so maybe we can get to some of those. Israel's ramping up their operations in Gaza very dramatically. People are getting killed there in very large numbers. Volkswagen might have to shut 3 of their 10 plants in Germany and eliminate tens of thousands of jobs. This is a very important story that we didn't
Spain's
have.
underwater.
Yeah, Spain's underwater, right? We haven't had time to talk about any of these things. Well, not all of Spain, obviously, right?
No,
but the rain in Spain doesn't always fall mainly in the plain, it turns out. And so I'm hoping that we can get to all 3 of those things next week, but we might not have time then either, depending on what else happens.
All right, that'll do it for us on this November 1st, 2024 edition of Working for Crusoe. He's Sam, I'm John. Have a great weekend.
Please vote if you haven't. Thank you.